I present to your attention a trilogy of photo stories from different parts of Russia, dedicated to the mysteries of the Russian soul.
I am a skeptic. I do not believe in mysticism, psychics, ghosts and other nonsense. I am not afraid to walk past a cemetery in the dark, but one day something happened to me, either an obsession, or I don't know what to call it. I was then 12 years old. November, cloudy autumn day. We lived in a private house, ran a household. There was a shallow pit behind the house, in which beetroot was stored for the animals in autumn for the winter. But for some reason it was empty that year. There was a pile of sand near the pit. We were then building a new shed, and I loved to play in this sand. That day, for some reason, I went down into the pit and began to play there, digging a cave in one of the walls, when suddenly someone looked at me from there, concentrated, without blinking, without a face, only expressive eyes in the dark. I was numb for a second, then I don't remember how I jumped out of the hole. Although the edges were quite high for me. I run into the house, shouting to my grandmother, "Into the hole, into the hole." She did not understand what was in the hole, because I could not say anything more from fear, but she ran out of the house after me, went down into the hole, instinctively began to pick the pliable soil in the place where I began to dig a cave. The grandmother was in shock, began to rake further and found the body of her eldest son, already stiff, crying, screaming, calling the police, neighbors, witnesses. As it turned out later, a drunken uncle was killed in a quarrel a few days ago by his friends, and to our questions, did they see him after the evening drinking, they answered that they had drunk, and in the morning he packed up and left for some reason in the city. But the investigators still separated them. There was even a small note about this incident in our regional newspaper in the crime section. Many years have passed since then, and I still wonder what it was. After all, if I had not seen those strange eyes then, probably, they would not have found him.
It was a hot July day in 1999. I didn't want to leave the rooms with the darkened windows and the cold floor. It was my way of escaping the heat. But suddenly I got a call from a good acquaintance. He worked as a sort of entertainer at the local club, led discos in the evenings, children came in the afternoon to make crafts, and there was a chorus of grandmothers in Russian costumes, more like gypsy costumes, with wide skirts and motley scarves. But they sang well, pulling the song out not so much with their voice as with their soulfulness. Misha told me that some interesting people had come to the club to give a lecture about Rerik. And there are no people. So he calls all his friends to come. For free. I didn't want to go. I tried to explain that I had no one to leave my son with. "So take him with you," said Misha. "Help me, no one wants to go. It will be interesting there." I went. And I didn't regret it. To this day that story still haunts me. There really weren't many people there, mostly children and Misha's many relatives. The windows were covered with curtains, not thick but translucent. There was a kind of semi-darkness in the hall. We were sitting in the hall, and then a woman came on stage. Oh, yes. I came with my son, who was 4 years old at the time. He had a stutter before the age of 3 and was cured by a witch doctor, also an interesting story, and because of that, he was very awkward to talk to and very attached to me. It was hard for me, and it was impossible to leave him even with his grandmother, and his grandmother took offense and said that we were setting him against her. In short, it was a tense situation in the family. He didn't communicate with strangers, he didn't communicate at all. But he had an unusually early development. At 2 years old he knew all the letters, and at 3 he was already reading. And when he read, he didn't stutter. He rejected children's books and was not interested in all sorts of cocks and chanterelles. The first book he read was a brief dictionary of aesthetics, in a nice binding and small format. I don't think he understood anything in it, but he read it aloud with fascination. Imaginism is an aesthetic concept of artistic creation. My girlfriends would just fall over when they came to visit him, a child sitting on the potty and reading aloud about etiquette. My friend, an elementary school teacher, said, "I've never seen kids like that before." The second book was Solovyov's Bolotnikov's Rebellion, where he tortured me with questions about the Cossacks. So that you, my dear readers, are not completely disbelieved in my story, I will say that my son's abilities disappeared as suddenly as they appeared. He is now an adult student. He doesn't like to read at all, only textbooks. Let's go back to our hall. I do not remember anything of what the lecturer said. I do not remember whether she was alone or with someone else. I somehow fell into a trance from her voice, from the semi-darkness of the hall, and woke up when I suddenly saw a bright glowing white ball the size of a tennis ball hanging over the woman's left shoulder. I looked toward the windows to see the beam. But the windows were covered with curtains. I looked around warily to see if anyone else could see. No, everyone was sitting half asleep. You know, I'd forgotten about the balloon. I only remembered it at home. If you have any questions, ask them. The lecturer exclaimed in a cheerful voice, and everyone woke up. There were no questions. I wanted to go home. And then the unexpected happened to me, cleaner than a glowing balloon. My son, who had never spoken to strangers in his life, stood up and said, "Auntie, why do I get scared when I watch TV?" A woman ran down the steps from the stage into the auditorium and approached us. "Whose baby is that?" "Mine," I said, and I got scared. She stared at him like he was some kind of miracle. Then she said to him, verbatim, but something like, "Baby, you're right, don't watch TV, it's no good." And she says to me, "Take care of him. He's got an old soul. He's living for the last time." I was just stunned. I wasn't expecting such an end to the lecture. On the way home, I tried to ask my son why he asked his aunt and didn't tell me about his fears, but my son withdrew and didn't answer. Many years have passed, and sometimes I wonder what it was. Who were these traveling lecturers? For my son, the prognosis came true. He is a young man, intelligent, handsome blonde with green eyes, but older than my parents in his reasoning and actions. He doesn't have the liveliness, the cheerfulness of youth. He somehow thinks inside out, sees situations from an unexpected angle. His relatives think he's strange. He has one friend, and he's autistic. Ani. Animals and insects like him. In the garden he was talking to a bumblebee and feeding it. "He's tired," he said, "he flew far away. Let him spend the night here." In his hands wilted plants come to life. He doesn't kill flies and spiders, he brings them out. It's crazy. I don't know how to respond to this. Is there reincarnation, and is this his last earthly incarnation?
What I'm about to tell you happened in 1990. I was working in geology, in the taiga. There were 6 of us in the unit, the head of the unit, a geologist, a geophysicist, it was me, a student and 2 workers. We set up camp on the bank of a mountain stream, which was in the taiga. We put up 3 tents and made a place for the fire. There was a spring 5 meters away from us, from which we could take water for drinking and cooking. The days were sunny. We set out on the route as soon as it began to dawn and returned at dusk. 2 weeks later we were told on the radio that we had to go urgently for supplies. It was raining everywhere. The level of the Shilka River, 10 kilometers away and separating us from the main base, began to rise. The next day, early in the morning, the squad leader, the student and the 2 workers left for the base. I and the geologist girls stayed at the camp. Our men promised to return the next day in the morning. In the evening, a strong wind suddenly blew. The trees groaned under its pressure and made a creaking, gnashing, and cracking sound. All living creatures, birds and beasts lay low, as if waiting for trouble. It went on like that for about 2 hours. At that time the sky was covered with heavy leaden clouds. It seemed as if they were about to fall to the ground, crushing it with their weight. A black veil covered the taiga. The wind abruptly stopped, as if someone above had turned off a huge fan. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated everything around. And then it started to rain. We were sitting in the tent. Lita, geologist, was reading a book and I was processing work materials. Suddenly we heard a terrible roar. We rushed out of the tent and saw that the creek had turned into a menacing, raging river. The water was dragging huge boulders. The fire pit had gone underwater and was already beginning to flood the tent with food. We rushed to save them. In the turmoil, we carried sugar, salt, bacon and canned meat to the tent because our tent was on an elevated site and there was hope that the water would not overwhelm it. The water was pouring in like a bucket, and our feet were knee-deep in water. While we were dragging everything, we were cold and very tired. Lita immediately climbed into her sleeping bag and in 5 minutes was already asleep. And I had to finish my work. So, having heated the stove to get warm and changed into dry clothes, I sat down to work. Behind the tent wall, bad weather was raging and the river was rumbling. The wood crackled in the stove. I began to warm up. Suddenly I was alerted by a sound that blended in with the existing sounds. At first I heard a baby crying. But where can a baby come from in the taiga, where the nearest village is 100 kilometers away? I listened and thought I was imagining things. 10 minutes passed and I heard crying again, but more distinctly. It lasted about 10 to 15 seconds, and then I heard laughter, which made my hair stand on end. I couldn't help it and woke Lita up. At first she didn't hear anything in her sleep, but when the laughter sounded again, she turned pale and asked, "What is it?" The thunder gradually subsided. The peals of thunder sounded less and less often, the sound was muffled. The rain also began to subside. The laughter was approaching our camp. I persuaded the girl to get out of the tent and determine which side the laughter was coming from. Maybe we could figure out who or what was making it. We went out and started listening. The rain had finally stopped, only heavy drops were dripping from the trees. It should have been dawn soon. The laughter stopped and started again. It sounded ominous. Then the laughter was joined by a sound that sounded like bells ringing and a saw screeching at the same time. Lita crawled back into the tent out of fear and started screaming for me to get in and close the canopy, too. As if the tent could protect us. I was too frightened to move, numb, and only stared in the direction from which the sounds came. Everything around me began to turn gray. In that direction, I saw indistinct dark shadows, about 2 meters high. There were several of them. They were between the trees. They looked like blurred figures of people in some kind of rags. I began to recite the Lord's Prayer, first in a whisper and then at full voice. They froze in place, swaying from side to side. Suddenly the sun's rays cut through the space. It was dawn. The shadows trembled, it was like a convulsion, and melted away. On cotton legs I made my way to a stump that was a meter from our tent, and sank down on it. "Did you see them?" I shuddered in surprise. Lita, and that was her, looked in the direction where the ghosts had recently been. "Who?" "Shadows." I looked back at her. "Where did you see them from when you went into the tent?" To which she replied, "When you didn't want to go in, I went out again and looked in the same direction you did and saw them." It was creepy. When the men returned, we told them about that night. The squad leader didn't believe us at first, and we made it all up. There was laughter. And then one worker, he used to be a hunter, a local, he believed us. He looked at everybody and said, "They weren't dreaming. They saw the whole thing for real. They weren't the first ones to tell us about it. There's a dead place, a swamp, about 50 kilometers from here. A lot of people have died there. The swamp itself begins abruptly and inconspicuously. If you look from the side, It's just a meadow with puddles of water. But the shadows didn't usually stray that far from the swamp. Something made them move this way. My advice: let's move the camp up the creek. There's a good spot up there. It's about 2 kilometers from here. This time nobody laughed anymore. The squad leader said okay, and that same day we moved to the new place. Nothing else happened the whole time we were working in that area.